She stepped upon the stage with a husky voice that did not beg for attention but commanded it, cutting through the haze of cigarette smoke and restless whispers, her eyes sharp as if mocking the very audience she came to enchant. It was the 1920s. Broadway was restless, and into its heartbeat came a woman who seemed both flame and ash, a creature not bound by any rule. They would say later that this was the moment Tallulah Bankhead became unforgettable, that here began the mingling of scandal and legend, forever tied to her name. Welcome, my dear listener, to this story that drifts across time like smoke curling in lamplight. I invite you to share in the comments the place and hour from which you listen, so that our voices form a thread through the world. And if you have not yet, please subscribe, so that together we may build a circle of memory, carrying stories from past lives into the present. In the quiet town of Jasper, Alabama, on a January day in 1902, a child was born into a household where privilege and sorrow sat uneasily side by side. She was christened Tallulah Bankhead, a name with the sound of river water and old soil, a name that even as a child seemed too heavy for her small frame. Her father was William Bankhead, a man of ambition who would rise to become Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, his presence stern and unyielding. Her mother, Ada Eugenia, delicate and fragile, left this world only weeks after Tallulah first opened her eyes, leaving behind not just a child, but a vacancy that no amount of affection could quite fill. It is said that Tallulah's mother whispered, as she lay fading, a hope that her infant daughter would not forget her. But how does one remember a voice never truly heard, a face seen only in the softness of early dreams? Perhaps this absence carved into Tallulah a hollow space, one she would try all her life to fill with laughter, applause, affection, and yes, scandal. For the child grew quickly into a girl with restless eyes, eyes that did not stay long upon the lace curtains of her southern home, but seemed already to gaze beyond, toward places where voices were louder and rules more fragile. In Alabama, she learned early the rituals of Southern society, of church pews polished smooth by generations, of women who carried themselves with proper restraint, of men whose authority filled the air. Yet Tallulah was different. Her tongue carried an edge, her laughter arrived too loud, and her movements seemed forever too free. Even as a child, she liked to mimic, to perform, to turn the dull gatherings of adults into stages upon which she reigned as both jest and spectacle. Those who knew her then would smile with indulgence, saying perhaps she was spoiled, perhaps she was eccentric, but few could have guessed that such sparks of rebellion would one day flare into a fire that scorched Broadway and Hollywood alike. Her father, though distant and occupied with his political ascent, maintained pride in the brilliance of his daughter. But in the Bankhead household there was also a shadow of sadness. Tallulah's mother gone, her sister Evelyn by her side. The family's world seemed divided between public duty and private ache. In the photographs that remain, one sees a child dressed carefully, curls set just so. But behind the smile there seems always an impatience, as if the stillness of Alabama could not contain her. One may wonder, in the slow evenings when crickets hummed and the scent of magnolia drifted through the open windows, what dreams filled young Tallulah's restless mind? Did she already imagine a life upon the stage, the roar of applause in place of a mother's lullaby? Or did she only wish for escape, for anything that would break the silence of small-town respectability? The truth is veiled, as truths often are, but the child was already becoming the woman, restless, searching, unwilling to bow before expectation. By the time Tallulah was a teenager, her wit had sharpened into something both delightful and dangerous. Teachers despaired at her lack of discipline, friends adored her mischief, and suitors found themselves baffled by her refusal to act as a proper Southern lady. She was already spinning stories, inventing little dramas, testing the power of her voice. And yet, behind the performance, one could sense a hunger, a need to be seen not just as charming, but as unforgettable. It is curious to consider how place shapes a soul. Alabama in the early 20th century was a land of tradition, bound by codes of honor and appearances. To grow up within it while rejecting it required both courage and recklessness. Perhaps Tallulah absorbed from her environment not only the beauty of the South, but also the deep tension between surface and truth. For beneath the lace and gentility lay shadows of inequality, unspoken grief, and silence. Tallulah would carry into her art and her life a refusal to remain silent, a determination to break through conventions even if it meant scandal. There are stories of her youthful rebellions, of sneaking away to flirt and laugh, of mocking the solemnities of her elders, of performing in amateur theatricals with a wildness that already seemed too large for the stage. Her voice, deep and husky, was unusual for a girl, and some whispered it was unbecoming. Yet this very voice, shaped by southern heat and mischief, would become her greatest weapon. It was a sound unlike others, a sound that lingered, carrying both seduction and mockery. Still, one must imagine the loneliness of those early years. A mother's absence is not easily replaced, and her father, though influential, was often away in Washington, bound to duty. Tallulah grew up in a house where presence was mixed with absence, where love was tangled with loss. This mixture perhaps fueled the contradictions she would embody all her life: the need for affection, the refusal to be tied down, the hunger for freedom, and the longing for intimacy. As adolescence gave way to youth, the horizon beyond Alabama became irresistible. Tallulah had read of the stage, of actresses whose names shone in lights, of worlds where wit and beauty could shape destiny. To remain in Jasper would have meant marriage to some local gentleman, life in the shadow of her father's political reputation, respectability but not fulfillment. She chose instead to step toward the unknown, leaving behind the familiar magnolia-scented nights for the clamor of distant cities. And so the restless girl began to shed the skin of her childhood. She carried with her not only her sharp tongue and radiant energy, but also the shadows of absence and longing. These would whisper through her life, guiding her toward brilliance and chaos in equal measure. The small town could not contain her, and the road out of Alabama became the first act of a drama that would stretch across oceans and decades. Picture her then, at the threshold of departure, the sky above tinged with the pink of the southern twilight, her eyes gazing not at the house she was leaving, but at the horizon ahead. The sound of cicadas filled the air, but already she heard something else. A distant applause that seemed to call her name. Was it memory? Was it fate? Or was it only the imagination of a restless girl, desperate to become more than what her birthplace intended? The image remains. A child of the South, dressed in fine fabric but wearing impatience upon her face, standing at the edge of her hometown, her voice already carrying the echo of laughter not yet uttered, scandal not yet begun. The horizon shimmered with promise, and beyond it waited London, Broadway, Hollywood, and the world. Yet in that moment she was still only a girl with restless eyes, longing for something she could not yet name. And perhaps that is how her story must begin, not with triumph or scandal, but with the quiet, unresolved gaze of a young Tallulah Bankhead, her spirit leaning outward toward the unknown. Her eyes remained fixed upon the horizon, though the horizon itself soon shifted from the red clay and green fields of Alabama to the wide and restless waters of the Atlantic. The departure was not merely a journey from one place to another, it was a shedding, a rebirth, a severing of roots that had bound her to a world too narrow for her restless heart. Tallulah Bankhead Barely more than a girl, carried within her the defiance of someone who refused to live within the walls built by others. She boarded the ship bound for Europe not only as a passenger, but as a pilgrim, seeking a stage large enough to match her voice and her spirit. The sea stretched before her in rolling grays and silvers, its surface broken by foam that seemed to whisper both welcome and warning. For many, the voyage across the ocean was a daunting trial, a separation from the known into the unknown. But for Tallulah, the uncertainty was an elixir. The air itself seemed freer once she stepped aboard, salted winds brushing against her cheeks, carrying away the fragrance of magnolia and the murmurs of southern propriety. Did she gaze over the railing at night, the stars scattered above her like sequins on dark velvet, imagining her own name glittering among them? Perhaps. She'd always been drawn to lights that burned brightly, even if they faded quickly. London awaited her, a city ancient and yet alive with its own kind of rebellion. The theater there was a world apart from the staid rhythms of Jasper or even the brash emergence of Broadway. The West End thrived with experiment and scandal, with playwrights who dared to question, with actors who embodied passion as if it were ritual. For Tallulah, London was not merely a city of fog and gaslight, but a stage upon which she could reimagine herself, free from the expectations that clung to her family name back home. Her arrival in England was not greeted with fanfare. She was young, unknown, untested, yet those who met her spoke quickly of her sharp tongue, her wit that cut like a blade through the dull fabric of small talk. She had a way of sitting in a room as though she owned it, even when she had no right to such claim. Directors, fellow actors, even patrons of the arts found themselves both bewildered and fascinated by this Southern girl, whose voice carried smoke and laughter. Her accent, foreign yet enchanting, gave her an air of mystery. In rehearsal halls and backstage corridors, she was noticed, even when she was not yet famous. There were failures, of course. Her first auditions were not met with universal approval. Some found her manner too bold, her speech too unusual, her presence unsettling. But Tallulah had never been one to shrink beneath rejection. She wore failure as though it were another costume, discarding it with a laugh and a flick of her cigarette. The theater world in London was unforgiving, yet she thrived in its harshness, for it matched the harshness she had already known in life. To lose a mother at birth, to grow up with absence at the center of her being, had given her a resilience few could match. What was a failed audition compared to that? Soon, opportunities came. Small roles at first, then larger ones. She threw herself upon the stage with an energy that seemed both careless and precise, as though she had discovered the art of making chaos look like art. Audiences were unsettled, then enchanted. There was something raw in her, something unrefined, and yet it was precisely that rawness that made her stand apart in a city where many performances still clung to tradition. She was not graceful in the expected sense, not delicate, but she was unforgettable. It was in these years that her reputation began to spread beyond the confines of the theater. London society, always eager for someone to shock and amuse them, found Tallulah irresistible. At parties, she drank freely, laughed too loudly, and spoke truths others were too polite to say. She made companions among artists and aristocrats alike, moving through their drawing rooms as though she were a storm they had invited in by accident. Yet even as she scandalized, she was adored. Her beauty was unconventional, her voice unlike any other, and her wit both savage and playful. In this, she was learning the art of being Tallulah Bankhead, a role she would play for the rest of her life, with more commitment than any scripted character. One must imagine her in those London nights, stepping out of a carriage into mist, her dress catching the faint glow of gas lamps, her laughter spilling into the fog as though daring the darkness to silence her. There is a kind of magic in being young in a foreign city, when everything seems possible and nothing yet determined. Tallulah embodied this magic, even when her choices bordered on ruin. The city tested her, and she tested the city in return, pressing against its boundaries, mocking its proprieties, seducing its audiences. Yet beneath the bravado, did she feel the loneliness of exile, the absence of family, the distance from familiar voices, the weight of expectation that perhaps still reached her from across the ocean? It is difficult to say, for Tallulah rarely showed her inner sorrow. She cloaked herself in scandal and wit, using them as both shield and weapon. And perhaps in London this armor became more polished, more formidable, preparing her for the greater stages that awaited. In her early performances, critics began to notice not only her energy, but her ability to hold attention. She did not always deliver lines as expected, but she delivered them with such conviction that the unexpected became truth. This quality, the refusal to be ordinary, was her gift and her curse. She could make a mediocre play memorable simply by inhabiting it with her peculiar force. And yet, it also meant she was never easy to contain, never a safe choice. Directors alternated between frustration and admiration, uncertain whether she was genius or chaos. London began to whisper her name, Tallulah Bankhead. The sound of it was strange, foreign, and yet it lingered in the memory. Some adored her, some despised her, but few forgot her. In smoky theaters, in whispered conversations at late-night suppers, in columns of society gossip, her presence began to swell. She had not yet conquered the stage, but she had entered its bloodstream. There is something inevitable in such a rise. Some spirits are too restless to remain in obscurity. They will be noticed, even if it means breaking every rule. Tallulah was such a spirit. She was not content with being one of many. She had to be singular. And so, through wit, scandal, and sheer force of presence, she began to shape her legend. The fog of London clung to the streets. The echo of horse-drawn carriages still mingled with the hum of motor cars, the air thick with both tradition and change. In this landscape, Tallulah found her stage, her proving ground. And as she stood in the wings, waiting for her cue, cigarette smoke curling in the dim light, one might imagine her heart not trembling with fear, but with anticipation, eager to leap into the blaze of attention. The curtain rose, the lights fell upon her, and the girl from Alabama was no longer only a daughter of the South. She was becoming something else, an actress, a scandal, a voice that carried across oceans. And as her words filled the theater, somewhere beyond the walls, a glass of champagne was raised in her honor, laughter spilling into the night, unfinished, unresolved. The champagne glass, lifted in some dimly lit salon of London, caught the glow of lamplight for only a moment before being set down, its surface marked by a trace of laughter. It is from this small gesture, a glass half finished and left upon a table, that Tallulah's ascent into the embrace of the West End truly begins. She had arrived a stranger, unknown, foreign in tongue and manner, but within only a handful of seasons she was spoken of as though she were London's own, a curiosity, a scandal, and in time, a darling. In the late 1920s, the city was alive with contradictions. The war was past, but its shadows remained, a generation carrying wounds both visible and unseen. London society sought distraction, sought brilliance, sought those who could remind them of life's absurdity and fleeting beauty. Into this need walked Tallulah Bankhead, with her husky voice and ungoverned presence, as though conjured by the very restlessness of the age. Audiences were not certain what to make of her, for she was not delicate, not refined in the English manner, but there was a force within her that could not be ignored. Her first notable success came with performances that critics hesitated to call polished, yet they admitted she had something rare, the ability to hold the gaze of 1,000 strangers and make them feel as though the play existed only for them. Some said it was her timing, others her voice, still others the sheer boldness with which she spoke lines that might have been ordinary in another's mouth, but, in hers, carried heat and danger. She was, as one commentator remarked, less an actress than a presence, and presence in the theater can eclipse all else. The city's fashionable circles quickly took notice. Parties in Belgravia and Mayfair began to feature her name upon their lists, and there she would appear, wrapped in silk or satin, cigarette poised between long fingers, her laughter spilling across the room. The English elite, accustomed to a more restrained elegance, found themselves both shocked and delighted by this American girl who dared to mock propriety in their very drawing rooms. She spoke openly of matters others avoided, made jokes at the expense of the powerful, and offered her affections to men and women alike with a candor that left some blushing and others enchanted. To be scandalous in London was not new, but to be scandalous and adored was rare. Tallulah possessed the strange gift of making her indiscretions seem not shameful but exhilarating, as though to witness her was to taste freedom, however briefly. Women admired her refusal to bow before convention. Men admired her boldness, and both gossiped of her constantly. In time, she seemed less like a visitor from America and more like a spirit conjured from the city's own hunger for rebellion. On stage, her fame deepened. She appeared in plays that were daring for their time, works that spoke of passion, betrayal, and desire without the veil of gentility. Tallulah did not soften these themes. She embodied them with a frankness that unsettled and thrilled. Critics wrote that she was both magnetic and unpredictable, a performer who could command silence one moment and laughter the next, yet always on her own terms. Directors sometimes despaired of her willfulness, but they could not deny the effect she had upon an audience. A Bankhead performance was never safe, never ordinary, and therefore always an event. Her admirers began to call her the toast of the West End. Newspapers printed her remarks, often outrageous with a mixture of disapproval and delight. She seemed to thrive upon the very attention others might have fled from, weaving scandal into her identity as though it were a garment she wore with pride. Yet behind the headlines and the laughter, there was still the restless child from Alabama, the girl who had grown up in the shadow of absence. One wonders whether, as she took her bows before applauding crowds, she imagined her mother among them, unseen yet present. Life off stage mirrored the chaos of her performances. She was rarely alone, surrounded by friends, lovers, and admirers, yet loneliness clung to her in quiet moments. Her relationships, passionate and volatile, often ended as swiftly as they began. Still, she carried herself with the assurance of one who believed life was meant to be devoured, not savored slowly. London at night became her second stage. The clinking of glasses, the swirl of smoke, the murmur of conversations, and her laughter ringing above them all. These were as much a part of her legend as the plays she performed. And yet, beneath the glitter of society and the heat of the theater lights, there were moments of stillness. A dressing room after the performance, the air heavy with powder and perfume, the echo of applause still faint in her ears. In such moments, what did Tallulah feel? Did she bask in triumph, or did she feel again the hollow left by a mother she never knew? Did the praise of strangers fill the absence, or did it only remind her of its depth? These questions linger unanswered, as shadows always do in the lives of those who burn brightly. The city, however, cared little for such hidden sorrows. To them, Tallulah was a star, unpredictable and irresistible. Her voice, her wit, her presence had become part of London's own rhythm. She had crossed the ocean as a restless girl and now stood as a woman who embodied both scandal and glamour, the darling of the West End. But as with all things that burn too brightly, there was always the danger of fading, of the applause quieting, of the lights dimming. For now, however, she reigned, her name spoken with admiration, her presence demanded at parties and theaters alike. She was no longer merely Tallulah Bankhead of Alabama. She was Tallulah, a singular name, a figure whose legend had already begun to write itself across the city's memory. The champagne glass, half filled and abandoned, remained as symbol, for her life was often like that. Laughter left unfinished, moments cut short, brilliance mingled with recklessness. And as the night of another performance drew to a close, the last sound heard in the theater was not applause, but the faint echo of laughter drifting into the fog, unresolved, like a story still unfolding. The laughter that drifted into the London fog did not dissolve entirely. It lingered, traveled, and crossed back over the ocean from which she had first come. In time, the echo of Tallulah's voice returned to America, where Broadway, impatient and hungry for novelty, waited with curiosity for the girl who had charmed the West End. Her return was not that of a prodigal daughter, humbly seeking her place, but of a queen arriving to claim a throne she had long imagined for herself. By the early 1930s, New York City was already a stage unlike any other. Its streets pulsed with restless ambition, its theaters alive with both triumph and failure. The Great Depression had cast a long shadow, yet in the midst of hardship, people sought escape, sought to forget their worries in the glow of marquees and the warmth of applause. Into this atmosphere stepped Tallulah Bankhead, the Southern girl reshaped into a transatlantic sensation, her name carrying both scandal and allure, before she even set foot upon the Broadway boards. Her first appearances were met with a kind of electric anticipation. Reporters flocked to describe her return, noting the husky voice, the striking manner, the way she seemed to devour the very air of the city. Audiences, weary from their own struggles, found themselves drawn to her boldness, her refusal to soften herself for comfort. She played roles with the same reckless authenticity she had brought to London, inhabiting characters as though she were tearing away at the fabric of the play itself, exposing what lay beneath. Critics were divided. Some called her magnetic, others too unrestrained, but all agreed she could not be ignored. It is said that Broadway at that time was a city within a city, a kingdom of its own where reputations could be made or destroyed in a single night. Tallulah understood this and embraced it. She had not returned to America to be one among many. She had returned to dominate. And so she threw herself into each performance, as though the theater were her temple, the stage her altar, and the applause her sacrament. In plays such as The Little Foxes, where she portrayed the ruthless Regina Giddens, she electrified audiences, her voice curling around each line with venom and allure. The role suited her as though it had been written for her alone, and in many ways it was. The fierce woman who defied every boundary, who cared nothing for gentility, who grasped and demanded what others feared to touch. Her fame in New York spread quickly beyond the theater walls. Parties in Manhattan found her presence impossible to ignore. She swept into rooms with a cigarette in one hand, a quip upon her lips, and an energy that unsettled even the most composed socialites. To some, she was outrageous, even vulgar. To others, she was the embodiment of freedom. In either case, she was unforgettable. The press chronicled her every remark, often scandalous, always sharp, and her reputation as Broadway's most daring personality grew. Yet fame carries its shadows. Behind the brilliance of her performances and the sparkle of her wit lay the old restlessness, the hunger for something deeper. Broadway gave her triumph, but triumph alone could not fill the hollow she carried. Did she find herself, after the curtain had fallen and the audience departed, standing alone in her dressing room with silence pressing in? Did she hear again the faint echo of her mother's absence, the sound of love never known? Perhaps. But Tallulah rarely allowed such moments to be seen. She cloaked herself in noise, in laughter, in company, refusing to let silence expose her vulnerability. Her relationships in New York were as tumultuous as her performances. Lovers came and went, both men and women, drawn to her flame and burned by it in turn. She gave herself freely, yet never entirely, as though intimacy were both desired and feared. Friends adored her, enemies gossiped about her, but none could deny her power. Even her failures on stage, inevitable in a career of such risk, did not diminish her legend. For Tallulah was never measured by consistency, but by presence, by the sheer audacity of being herself in a world that demanded conformity. Broadway itself seemed to bend around her. She embodied its contradictions, glamorous yet chaotic, celebrated yet scandalized, adored yet whispered about with disapproval. In the midst of the Great Depression, when so many clung to order and respectability, she offered a vision of life lived without restraint. Audiences, perhaps secretly yearning for such freedom, both condemned and envied her. She was a mirror in which they saw their own unspoken desires, their hidden rebellions, their longing for a life less bound. There are accounts of her walking the streets of Manhattan at night, fur coat brushing against her ankles, cigarette glowing in the darkness, her laughter rising above the clamor of the city. She seemed to belong not only to the theaters but to the very pulse of New York itself. Cab drivers knew her name, doormen bowed with a mixture of respect and amusement, and young women whispered of her as both scandal and inspiration. She had become, in truth, Broadway's queen, not by virtue of perfection, but by the force of her will and the daring of her spirit. And yet, what is a queen without her crown? For Tallulah, the crown was not made of jewels or titles, but of attention, of applause, of being the center of the stage and the conversation. The risk of such a crown is that it must constantly be defended, constantly renewed. She understood this, perhaps too well, and so she gave herself to Broadway with reckless abandon, even as it consumed her strength and demanded more than she could always give. Still, in those years, she stood at her height. Tallulah Bankhead, once the restless child of Alabama, once the unknown actress who dared to conquer London, now ruled the greatest stage in America. Her name alone drew crowds. Her presence electrified the city. Her voice filled not only theaters, but the pages of newspapers and the whispers of society. She had become legend, and legends, once formed, are not easily undone. But as the curtain fell on one performance, as the applause faded into the night, there always remained the question of what came next. Could the brilliance last? Could the flame endure without consuming itself? These questions lingered, unanswered, like the whispers rising from the crowd as they left the theater, their footsteps fading into the New York night. And from within the theater, as the curtain was pulled closed, one could still hear it. The faint rustle of fabric, the murmurs of departure, unresolved, suspended in the darkness. The murmurs of the departing crowd lingered like the last notes of a fading song, footsteps dissolving into the New York night. But another kind of murmur began to rise in distant corridors far from Broadway. It was the whisper of film reels, of silver screens, of a new empire called Hollywood that was reshaping how stories were told and remembered. The theater had long been Tallulah's temple, but the allure of cinema, with its lights and illusions, could not be ignored. And so, even as she reigned on Broadway, her restless spirit turned its gaze once again toward a horizon, this time toward California, where the shadows of palm trees fell across studio lots and the promise of immortality flickered upon celluloid. Hollywood in the early 1930s was a kingdom of contradictions. It offered glamour but demanded obedience, created legends but often devoured them. For Tallulah, who lived as though rules were meant only to be mocked, the marriage of her unrestrained self with the rigid machinery of the film industry was destined to be uneasy. Yet she could not resist its pull. to see her presence captured forever, to know her voice would echo not only in theaters, but in every corner of America, was too tempting for a spirit that craved both attention and immortality. Her first appearances on screen carried the same quality that had divided stage audiences. She was unforgettable, but not always comfortable. The camera, unblinking and merciless, caught every flicker of her expression, every curve of her voice. Some critics found her too large for the screen, her presence overwhelming in a medium that often favored restraint. Others marveled that such a woman existed at all, her husky voice seeming to belong more to smoky cabarets and midnight confidences than to the tidy frames of film. She did not fit neatly into Hollywood's mold, and in truth, she did not try. There were directors who adored her recklessness, believing it brought something raw to their films. There were others who despaired, unable to tame her into the careful poses they desired. Tallulah herself often grew impatient with the process. Theater had given her immediacy, the living pulse of an audience, the thrill of applause that rose and fell with her every gesture. Film demanded repetition, patience, surrender to the eye of the camera rather than the collective breath of a crowd. For a woman who thrived on chaos and surprise, such discipline was a cage, and yet the world outside the studio was captivated. The name Tallulah Bankhead appeared not only on marquees but in the gossip columns, her sharp remarks and scandalous behaviors making her as much a star off-screen as on. Hollywood society, already accustomed to excess, found her a creature who could outdo even its most reckless figures. She drank with abandon, partied until dawn, offered her affections without apology, and shocked the cautious with her wit that spared no one, least of all herself. For every film she made, there were a dozen stories whispered in drawing rooms and printed in newspapers, stories that seemed to blur the line between performance and life. The roles she was given in Hollywood often failed to contain her. She was too fierce for ingenues, too unpredictable for neatly scripted heroines. There was always something in her that resisted being shaped by another's design. The screen captured her beauty, her magnetism, but it also revealed the tension between her wild spirit and the medium's demand for precision. In time, she grew disenchanted. Hollywood, with all its glitter, felt to her like a mirage, shimmering but insubstantial, promising eternity, but offering only confinement. Yet, as with London and New York, she left her mark. Audiences remembered her voice, her piercing eyes, her way of making even a small role feel like a tempest. She was not destined to be a queen of cinema as she had been of the stage, but she became something else. A legend of Hollywood's edges, a figure whose scandals and defiance embodied the wildness the industry pretended to tame. Some stars became icons of glamour. Tallulah became an icon of audacity. One may wonder whether she truly desired success in film or whether she sought merely the experience, the taste of another kingdom. For Tallulah was never still, never content with one triumph. Her life was a restless voyage, a series of stages upon which she played herself again and again, testing the boundaries of every arena she entered. Hollywood gave her yet another stage, and though she did not conquer it in the way others did, she transformed it into part of her legend. In those years, photographs of her began to circulate widely, her hair cropped short, her eyes glimmering with mischief, her mouth curved in a smile that seemed to promise both danger and delight. She was more than a performer. She was a symbol of something unrestrained, something society both condemned and envied. Her image, flickering on screens across America, whispered of freedom, of scandal, of a life lived without apology. For many, she became not only entertainment, but a secret dream of rebellion. But behind the glamour, behind the roles and the laughter, the same contradictions remained. Hollywood could not give her what she sought, for what she sought was not merely fame, but fulfillment. Not merely applause, but love that could soothe the hollow within her. The studio lights could illuminate her face, but they could not warm the spaces of loneliness that lingered after the cameras stopped. She carried on, dazzling in public, restless in private, her life becoming ever more entwined with the myth of Tallulah Bankhead rather than the woman herself. And so the reel of film flickered, its light shaking upon the wall, images of Tallulah moving and speaking, immortal yet fragile. The audience sat in the dark, transfixed by her presence, while she herself stood elsewhere, already restless, already seeking the next horizon. Hollywood had claimed a piece of her, but never all of her, for she was too wild to belong to any single stage, too restless to be bound by any single form of art. The flicker of the reel continued, shadows and light dancing across the screen, unresolved, like a question still awaiting its answer. The faint glow of the film reel still flickered in the darkness, a fragile beam trembling against the wall. And when the reel snapped, or the projector's hum fell silent, Tallulah would step back into the night, away from the celluloid world, into rooms filled not with audiences, but with companions. If the stage and screen gave her fame, it was the company she kept that gave her life its chaos and color. For Tallulah was never one to sit alone in silence. She thrived in the storm of voices, in laughter that lasted until morning, in the kind of friendships and affairs that blurred into legend. Hollywood and Broadway alike whispered about the gatherings she frequented, in shadowed salons, in the smoke-filled corners of speakeasies, in the drawing rooms of Manhattan townhouses and the hillside mansions of California. She was there, the center of a circle that burned with mischief and desire. Her friends were artists and poets, actors and musicians, aristocrats and outlaws, drawn together by her daring presence. To be near her was to be swept into a world where restraint was mocked, where wit was currency, and where scandal was never avoided but often deliberately invited. Among the company she kept were names still remembered, fellow stars of stage and screen, writers who scribbled by candlelight, painters who saw her not only as a muse, but as a challenge. She befriended Tennessee Williams, who found in her a kindred spirit, someone who understood the raw edges of longing he so often placed into his plays. She crossed paths with Zelda Fitzgerald, another Southern woman too wild for the cages of society, and around her whirled a constellation of admirers and lovers, some whispered about openly, others hidden in the shadows of discretion. Her affairs were not limited by gender, nor did she pretend otherwise. Men courted her, women adored her, and she moved between them with the same ease with which she moved from stage to screen. To some, her openness was scandalous. To others, it was intoxicating. She gave herself to love as she gave herself to performance, with abandon, with wit, with the promise of fire that could warm and burn at once. Some lovers remembered her as generous, others as destructive, but all remembered her. In this, perhaps, lay her true hunger, not merely to be loved, but to be unforgettable. The parties where Tallulah reigned were themselves like performances. She would enter a room in a cascade of laughter, her cigarette glowing, her eyes darting with mischief. Her remarks, sharp and often shocking, silenced even the boldest conversationalists, and then turned silence into laughter. She was outrageous, yes, but never dull. People gathered around her not only for pleasure, but to witness her, to be able to say they had been present when Tallulah Bankhead spoke her latest, wicked truth. To be in her circle was to feel the electric charge of life lived without restraint, even if only for a night. Yet her circle was not only made of laughter. There were arguments, jealousies, betrayals. Her passion for freedom sometimes wounded those who sought constancy. Her sharp wit, though dazzling, could cut deep, leaving friends smarting beneath the laughter. And behind it all lingered the question: did she surround herself with noise to escape silence? Did she collect lovers and companions not merely from desire but from fear of loneliness? If so, she rarely admitted it. Her circle, chaotic and shifting, became both her shield and her mirror, reflecting the contradictions within her. Hollywood, already a city built upon illusion, both admired and feared such company. Executives worried about the stories that reached the newspapers, the whispered tales of nights too wild, of lovers too numerous, of remarks too sharp. But Tallulah seemed immune to their warnings. She never sought to be contained. Indeed, she seemed to delight in proving that she could shock even a city accustomed to excess. If others built careful masks for public life, she tore hers away and dared the world to look at her barefaced. There is a story told of one party where, arriving late and already glowing with drink, she dropped her fur coat to reveal she wore nothing beneath it. The room gasped, then laughed, and she stood there, arms spread wide, the embodiment of scandal turned into spectacle. Was it exhibition? Was it defiance? Or was it a cry for attention, for affection that went deeper than laughter? The truth remains tangled as it so often was with her. Among her circle were not only artists and aristocrats, but also those cast aside by society. She befriended outsiders, rebels, those who lived on society's margins. Perhaps she saw in them a reflection of herself, the girl from Alabama who never quite belonged, who always sought new horizons. To them, she offered not pity but camaraderie, sharing her laughter and her defiance as though they too were part of her restless family. But the company she kept was also her undoing at times. Nights of revelry bled into mornings of regret. Friendships strained beneath the weight of scandal, and lovers left with bitterness behind the passion. Yet still she moved forward. Still she gathered new companions, unwilling to live in solitude. For Tallulah, solitude was the true enemy, the silence that reminded her of the absence she had carried since infancy. Better to be surrounded by chaos, by voices, by laughter, than to be alone with her own thoughts. And so, the cigarette burned in a crowded room, its smoke curling upward as she held court among her chosen company. The night stretched on, laughter rising, scandal whispered, affection given and withdrawn. In such gatherings, Tallulah was both queen and jester, ruler and rebel, adored and condemned. She had found her family not in the respectability of Alabama, not in the order of politics, but in the unruly company of artists, lovers, and outcasts who shared her hunger for freedom. The cigarette smoldered in its ashtray, its ember faint but alive, unresolved, as though the night itself were unwilling to end. The cigarette ember glowed faintly in the crowded room, a tiny fire holding back the dark, and as the smoke curled upward, so too rose the words that Tallulah cast into the air. For more than her presence, more even than her beauty or her voice, it was her words that made her unforgettable. She wielded language as though it were both sword and caress, shocking, amusing, and cutting through the solemn layers of society. Where others measured their speech with care, Tallulah delighted in saying what no one else dared, and in doing so, she built a legend that was written not only on stages or screens, but in the scandalous music of her tongue. Her remarks filled gossip columns as readily as her performances filled theaters. She could take a polite question and turn it into an outrageous confession, leaving interviewers blinking, their pens unable to keep pace. When asked why she never had children, she replied with a frankness that stunned. "I adore children, but I couldn't eat a whole one." Such wit shocked, yet laughter followed quickly, and in that laughter was the recognition of truth wrapped in jest. She seemed to live by the principle that nothing was too sacred to be mocked, least of all herself. At parties, her wit was a kind of performance art. Surrounded by admirers and skeptics alike, she could silence a room with a single sentence, then fill it with laughter the next. No subject was off limits, no person immune. She teased the powerful, mocked the pompous, and confessed her own sins before others could whisper them. By turning her scandals into stories, by shaping her faults into jokes, she robbed gossip of its sting. What could be held against her when she herself proclaimed it openly and with such relish? This language of scandal became her armor. Beneath it, she carried vulnerabilities, sorrows, and wounds, but in public, she allowed no one to glimpse them. If she was lonely, she joked about her lovers. If she was afraid of decline, she mocked her own excesses. If she was judged immoral, she exaggerated her sins until judgment itself seemed foolish. To live as Tallulah did required not only boldness, but also a shield, and her words were that shield, bright, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. Society of her time, bound outwardly by codes of propriety, secretly hungered for such voices. People pretended to be shocked, yet they repeated her lines in whispers and laughter, carrying them from salons to offices, from theaters to kitchens. In a world still governed by appearances, Tallulah's candor was both scandal and relief. She said aloud what others thought but dared not utter, and in doing so she unsettled and liberated them at once. Her sharp tongue did not spare herself. She often told stories of her own misadventures with the same relish she used to skewer others. She confessed to drinking too much, loving too recklessly, behaving too outrageously, and always with a laugh. By exposing herself, she made her audience complicit, binding them into her world of audacity. They could condemn her, but in doing so, they condemned their own laughter, their own secret enjoyment of her defiance. And so, scandal became less her downfall than her crown. Yet there was danger in such a crown. Words once spoken cannot be recalled, and Tallulah's remarks often followed her into places where they wounded as much as they amused. Producers hesitated to hire her, worried about what she might say in interviews. Critics sometimes dismissed her as more wit than talent, more scandal than actress. Even friends, stung by her barbs, withdrew at times. But she seemed to accept these losses as the price of freedom. Better, she believed, to speak too much than to silence herself for comfort. One might wonder what drove her to such relentless candor. Was it bravery? Was it recklessness? Or was it a refusal to be trapped by silence, the silence that had haunted her since infancy? Her mother gone before she could know her, her father distant, her childhood filled with absences. Perhaps it was this silence she fought against, filling every space with words, laughter, and scandal so that it could never claim her again. In this way, her language was not only scandal, but survival. By shocking the world, she reminded herself she was alive. By making others laugh, she created a momentary intimacy that kept loneliness at bay. Her wit was her rebellion against loss, her defiance of propriety, her cry that she would not be forgotten. For to be forgotten was her greatest fear, and words once spoken echo even after the speaker has left the room. There is a story of her standing before reporters, weary after a night of revelry, asked whether she considered herself a serious actress or merely a personality. She lifted her chin, her eyes flashing, and replied, "Darling, I am serious about one thing, being Tallulah Bankhead." The remark was printed across newspapers, ridiculed by some, celebrated by others. But in that one line, she captured the essence of her life. She was her own creation, her own art, and her own scandal. The world around her could never decide whether to scorn or adore her. Moralists condemned her recklessness. Feminists admired her defiance. Fellow actors marveled at her audacity. She embodied contradictions that could not be resolved, and perhaps that was why she fascinated. For in a time when society demanded clarity, right and wrong, moral and immoral, respectable and scandalous, she lived in the blur, the in-between, the space where truth mingled with performance, where laughter concealed sorrow, where scandal became survival. The newspapers continued to print her words, and the world continued to repeat them, even as the ink smudged and the meaning twisted. She had become a language unto herself, a voice that belonged not only to her, but to the age that produced her. In the end, Tallulah Bankhead was not merely an actress, nor merely a scandal. She was a sound, a cadence, a laugh that lingered even when the room grew quiet. And as the last line of another outrageous remark was spoken, the newspaper lay upon a table, its headline unfinished, the ink smudging under a careless hand, unresolved, as though waiting for the next scandal to be written. The newspaper lay upon the table, its headline unfinished, the ink smudged beneath a careless hand, and from that blurred print rose another truth that would shadow Tallulah's brilliance, her relentless turning toward drink, toward powders, toward whatever substance could sharpen laughter or soften sorrow. For if her wit was her armor, then alcohol and drugs became both her shield and her undoing, companions as constant as the lovers and friends who drifted in and out of her orbit. From the earliest days of her fame, glasses of champagne were placed in her hands as though they were part of her costume, as though to see Tallulah without a drink was to see her incomplete. In smoky London clubs, in Manhattan speakeasies, in Hollywood mansions perched above the city lights, the glass was never far. She raised it in toasts, in laughter, in mockery of herself and the world around her. At first it was ritual, social, a way of binding herself to her companions, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, it became necessity, a balm against the gnawing emptiness that applause alone could not fill. Alcohol gave her courage when courage faltered, gave her a rush of freedom when the world pressed too tightly against her, but it also dulled her sharpness, frayed her brilliance, and dragged her into scenes she could not fully command. There were nights when her remarks, once razor-sharp, stumbled into slurred confessions, mornings when her laughter gave way to silence heavy as stone. Yet even then, she wrapped her decline in jokes, quipping about her indulgence as though by naming it she could master it. She laughed at her own weakness, and the world laughed with her, even as the shadows lengthened. There were other substances, too, powders that promised energy, tablets that promised rest. The medicine cabinets of stars in Hollywood were often filled with such promises, and Tallulah's was no different. She used what was offered, not out of ignorance, but out of defiance, daring the world to judge her. If her body weakened, if her health faltered, she covered it with silk gowns and painted lips, stepping into rooms as though she were invincible. But no body is invincible, no spirit immune to the slow erosion of excess. Friends worried, sometimes gently, sometimes fiercely. They pleaded with her to slow, to rest, to guard her strength. Lovers tried to temper her, to shield her from herself. Doctors offered warnings. But Tallulah rarely listened. To live fully, she believed, meant to live without restraint. To deny herself was to betray herself. And so she drank, she indulged, she burned the candle at both ends until even the wax seemed to vanish in smoke. One cannot help but ask whether these indulgences were freedom or self-destruction. Did she drink because she loved the taste of wine, or because she feared the silence of sobriety? Did she seek intoxication for its pleasure, or to drown the echoes of loss that followed her from childhood? Perhaps both. Perhaps in each glass, in each powder, she found a brief moment of forgetting, a fleeting illusion that she was whole. And yet forgetting is not healing. It is only postponement. The hollow remained, waiting for her in the quiet hours when the laughter faded. On stage, the shadows sometimes showed. There were performances when her energy faltered, when lines slipped, when her brilliance dimmed. Critics remarked upon her unpredictability, not only the wildness that made her compelling, but also the recklessness that made her unreliable. Yet even in decline, she retained a magnetism others could not match. Audiences forgave her missteps, drawn still by the force of her presence. It was as though they sensed the battle beneath the surface, the struggle between light and shadow, freedom and destruction. They loved her not only for her triumphs, but for her flaws, seeing in her both glamour and fragility. In private, the toll was harsher. Friends recalled nights when she collapsed, when her body trembled from excess, when the laughter would not come. Her health began to weaken. Bronchitis, influenza, illnesses worsened by smoking and drinking. Her once radiant beauty grew marked by fatigue, her frame thinner, her energy more fragile. But still she refused to yield. To admit weakness would be to admit defeat, and Tallulah Bankhead was not one to surrender. Even in these shadows she remained surrounded by people, unwilling to face solitude. The company she kept continued to fill her nights with chatter and song, but behind her eyes there lingered a weariness that no companion could erase. Addiction is a lonely kingdom, one ruled not by friends but by cravings, and in that kingdom she often found herself a prisoner, even as she laughed and drank as though she were its queen. Her public image, however, absorbed even this. She became known not only for her wit and scandal, but for her excess. Stories of her drinking circulated as legend, her indulgence woven into the myth of Tallulah. She seemed to embrace it, as though by claiming it openly she could transform vice into identity. And so the line between freedom and destruction blurred until even she could no longer tell which was which. Yet one must remember, Tallulah lived in an age when women were judged more harshly than men for the same sins. Male actors drank and caroused, their reputations often untarnished, their excesses excused. Tallulah, by contrast, was condemned and celebrated at once, her indulgence magnified by her gender. In this, her scandal carried also the weight of defiance, an assertion that she would not be bound by rules written to control her. To drink openly, to smoke excessively, to indulge without apology. These were not only habits, but rebellions. They were declarations that she would not conform to the role society demanded of women. And yet, rebellion carries cost. Her health faltered, her performances grew erratic, her relationships strained beneath the weight of addiction. She laughed still, she spoke still, she scandalized still, but beneath it all the shadows deepened. Addiction, once a companion, had become a master, guiding her steps more than she guided her own. The glass remained upon the table, the faint clink of its base against wood lingering as though marking time. In that sound was both triumph and tragedy, the music of freedom and the echo of decline, unresolved, waiting for the silence that would eventually come. The glass upon the table lingered, its base leaving a faint ring upon the wood, as though marking not only time but also memory. From such traces one may follow the lines of Tallulah's life, for where there was drink, there was often love, or something that resembled love, passionate, reckless, fleeting, sometimes tender, sometimes cruel. Her affairs of the heart were as much a part of her legend as her stage triumphs or her outrageous wit. They formed a constellation of desire that burned brightly for a moment and then dissolved, leaving behind only echoes. Tallulah did not confine herself to the conventions of her time. She loved men, she loved women, she loved those who dazzled her with their intellect, their beauty, or their defiance. In this she was both scandalous and free. Society whispered, disapproved, condemned, yet also secretly admired. For she lived openly in ways others only dreamed of. If her affections unsettled, they also inspired, suggesting a world where desire need not be caged by rules written by others. Her lovers were many, and though names have been recorded, actors, writers, aristocrats, even political figures, what mattered less than their identities was the manner in which she gave herself to them. She loved with intensity, with abandon, as though each affair were the only one that ever existed. as though she could pour all the emptiness of her soul into a single embrace, and yet such passion rarely lasted. Lovers left or were discarded, friendships crumbled beneath jealousy, and what began as fire often ended in ashes. Still, she pursued love as though it were a role she could not refuse. Among men, she was courted by some of the most celebrated figures of her age. She flirted with Gary Cooper, admired the beauty of young actors just emerging, and was rumored to have entanglements with directors who both adored and despaired of her. But her openness with women was even more daring, for in that era such loves were often hidden, whispered of only in secrecy. Tallulah, however, rarely bothered with secrecy. She spoke openly of her affections, joked about them, made them part of her public identity. In this, she defied not only convention but also fear, daring the world to condemn her while she laughed in its face. There are stories of her affairs with women who themselves were legends, actresses whose names still shine, artists who carved their own place in history. Some affairs were brief, mere nights of passion. Others lingered, stretching across years with affection and quarrel alike. One of the most enduring was with actress Patsy Kelly, who later recalled their companionship with a mix of amusement and fondness. To those who knew her, Tallulah's love seemed less about gender and more about intensity. She sought souls that burned, that reflected her own wildness, that could meet her in the dangerous space between passion and destruction. And yet, behind the bravado, there was loneliness. She confessed, in rare quiet moments, that love always seemed to slip through her fingers. She longed for intimacy, yet recoiled from confinement. She craved devotion, yet mocked those who gave it too freely. The pattern repeated again and again. Passion ignited, burned brightly, then faltered. She moved on, gathering new lovers, new companions, new stories, but always carrying the hollow that no embrace could fill. Perhaps it was the absence of her mother, that first and most profound loss, that haunted every affair thereafter. To love, for Tallulah, was always to attempt to fill a space that could not be filled. Her wit often cloaked the ache. When asked about her lovers, she would quip with scandalous humor, turning heartbreak into comedy. She joked that her memory was so poor she had slept with some people twice without realizing it, or that her life was a series of one-night stands strung together with cigarettes. Such remarks entertained, but beneath them lay the truth. Love for Tallulah was both everything and never enough. Society, ever eager for scandal, exaggerated her affairs, turning whispers into headlines, innuendo into certainty. She became a symbol of unrestrained desire, condemned by some as immoral, celebrated by others as liberated. Yet the woman behind the myth remained elusive. Did she truly love those she embraced, or did she love the idea of love itself, the fleeting intoxication of passion? Did she ever find the devotion she sought, or did she tire of it when it threatened to bind her? The answers are lost, hidden behind laughter and gossip, behind stories repeated until fact and legend blurred. What is known is that her heart was restless as her spirit. She did not seek permanence. She sought fire, and fire by nature consumes quickly. Some lovers remembered her with bitterness, others with tenderness, but none forgot her. For even in love, as on stage, she demanded to be unforgettable. There is an image, half remembered, of Tallulah writing a letter late at night, cigarette smoke curling in the lamplight, the paper before her filled with words she would never send. Perhaps it was an apology, perhaps a confession, perhaps a plea for love. Whatever it was, the letter remained unsent, folded and silent, tucked away in a drawer or discarded into the fire. It is in such moments, unseen by the world, that one glimpses the vulnerability beneath her scandal, the quiet truth that even the wildest heart longs for understanding. And so her affairs, Her passions, her loves, public and hidden, celebrated and condemned, were less a tale of triumph or failure than a tapestry of longing, woven with threads of fire and ash. They defined her and eluded her, filled her nights with laughter, and left her mornings with silence. She lived them as she lived all things, fully, recklessly, without apology. The letter, folded and unsent, remained upon the table, unresolved, a symbol of the words she spoke too boldly and those she could never bring herself to say. The letter remained folded, unsent, its silence louder than words, and from that silence rose the noise of the world outside, for Tallulah could never remain hidden for long. Her life, her loves, her wit, her excesses, all became fodder for the gaze of the public, which pursued her with relentless fascination. If she was not on the stage or the screen, she was in the newspapers, her name printed in bold, her image captured by flashing bulbs, her words repeated in headlines and whispers alike. For Tallulah Bankhead did not merely live in the public eye, she made of it a stage, and the performance was herself. The 1930s and 1940s were decades when the machinery of celebrity had begun to accelerate. Hollywood studios managed stars with iron discipline, newspapers thrived on gossip, radio carried voices into every home, and Broadway made legends overnight. To survive in such a world often required obedience, careful crafting of image, and a talent for concealing private life. But Tallulah had little patience for concealment and less for obedience. She seemed to delight in undermining the very machinery that sought to shape her, offering not carefully prepared remarks, but outrageous confessions, not the quiet of propriety, but the roar of scandal. Photographers adored her. She posed with a knowing smile, her eyes half-lidded, her hair styled in waves that caught the light, her cigarette poised like punctuation. Each photograph suggested not just beauty, but audacity, a woman who could not be controlled. In magazines and newspapers, she became both glamour and warning, her image used to celebrate and to caution. To some, she was the embodiment of modern womanhood, independent, unrestrained, fearless. To others, she was a symbol of decadence, a cautionary tale of excess. She played with the public gaze as though it were a game. If reporters sought scandal, she gave them more than they could print. If critics condemned her morals, she mocked them openly. She understood that the public eye was hungry for outrage, and she fed it deliberately, turning herself into a character larger than any she had played on stage. This was both genius and danger, for while it made her unforgettable, it also made it difficult for audiences to separate Tallulah, the actress, from Tallulah, the scandal. Her interviews became legendary. She confessed to affairs, to drinking, to indulgence of every kind, often exaggerating for effect, turning truth and invention into indistinguishable performance. Journalists left her presence both delighted and disarmed, their pens struggling to capture the rapid fire of her wit. Readers devoured the stories, repeating her remarks with a mixture of shock and admiration. She had become a household name, not always for her roles, but for her persona, a kind of living myth who inhabited every parlor and drawing room conversation. Yet fame is a double-edged mirror. The applause that once thrilled her began to carry also the sting of judgment. Critics who praised her talent also scolded her behavior. Admirers who adored her boldness whispered of her decline when drink dulled her performances. The public, insatiable in its appetite, demanded both brilliance and scandal, condemning her even as it clamored for more. In this strange dance, Tallulah both led and followed, guiding the rhythm with her outrageousness, yet also caught in its relentless pull. There were moments when the gaze of the public wounded her. Though she laughed and joked, there are accounts of her weariness, of her frustration at being known more for her remarks than for her craft. She longed to be remembered as an actress, yet her life overshadowed her art. She was typecast not only in plays but in the imagination of society itself as the scandalous woman, the wit, the libertine. Her performances, however brilliant, were filtered through this lens, her every role interpreted as an extension of herself. Still, she refused to retreat. If the public demanded performance, she gave it freely. She treated interviews as theater, parties as stages, gossip as dialogue. She played herself with as much commitment as she played Regina Giddens or Sabina in The Skin of Our Teeth. And perhaps, in time, she became so adept at performing Tallulah Bankhead that the line between actress and woman blurred entirely. Was she ever only herself, or was she always performing, even in solitude? The question lingers, as questions often do when myth and life entwine. Her fame was not confined to the glittering capitals. Across America and even across oceans, people knew her name, repeated her lines, argued over her morality. She was admired in Paris salons, mocked in small-town newspapers, adored by soldiers who carried her image in wartime barracks. Her presence was everywhere. Her voice carried far beyond the theaters where it first enchanted. For a woman from Jasper, Alabama, the journey had been immense, yet she seemed always restless, always unsatisfied, always chasing the next horizon of attention. In these years, she both shone and faltered. Her public image grew brighter, yet her private struggles deepened. Addiction took its toll, relationships frayed, health weakened. But the public eye saw only the performance, not the exhaustion behind it. She kept the mask firmly in place, joking about her decline, mocking her own weaknesses, refusing to allow pity to replace laughter. She was determined that the world would remember her not as fragile, but as fierce. And so she moved through the glare of flashbulbs, through the ink of newspapers, through the chatter of society, her life a dance between adoration and condemnation. The world could not look away, and she would not let it. She had become more than an actress. She was a spectacle, a story, a scandal, a legend still in the making. The cameras flashed again, their light burning briefly against the night, dissolving into darkness, unresolved, as though the image they captured could never quite contain the truth of the woman before them. The camera's flash dissolved into darkness, leaving an afterimage upon the eye, a ghostly light that lingered longer than the moment itself. In that same way, Tallulah's public brilliance often concealed the shadows that clung behind it, sorrows too heavy to be carried into the glare of the stage. For though she laughed louder than others, though she mocked her own excesses and scandalized her critics with bravado, her private life was marked by griefs that rarely found voice. Beneath the armor of wit and the spectacle of scandal lay wounds that neither applause nor affection could heal. One of the deepest sorrows was her inability to bear children. Though she quipped in interviews, making light of her childlessness with jokes sharp enough to deflect pity, the truth beneath was heavy. She suffered multiple miscarriages, each one a quiet devastation hidden behind public laughter. There were doctor's visits, whispered warnings, nights of physical pain, mornings of emotional emptiness. For a woman who gave herself to passion so freely, the denial of lasting creation cut deeply. She spoke of her love for children often, played with them, delighted in their company, but her own arms remained empty. The absence became another hollow, another echo of loss, joining the silence of the mother she had never known. Her health, already weakened by years of indulgence, further betrayed her. Bronchitis, influenza, and later emphysema haunted her body, the cost of a lifetime of cigarettes and late nights. Her voice, once rich and husky, began at times to rasp with fatigue, its strength faltering even as audiences still thrilled to hear it. She collapsed more than once, overcome by exhaustion, and yet insisted upon returning to the stage as though defiance itself could keep her alive. Friends urged her to rest, to protect what remained of her health, but Tallulah could not easily surrender the pace that had defined her life. To slow down felt too much like yielding, and she had never been one to yield. Loneliness, too, was a companion. Surrounded as she was by friends, lovers, admirers, and critics, there were still hours when silence pressed heavily upon her. Lovers came and went, friends drifted away, and the crowds that adored her left when the curtain fell. In those solitary hours, without an audience, without a glass in hand, she confronted the hollowness that scandal could not fill. It is said that she sometimes wept alone, or sat silently in her dressing room, staring at her reflection as though searching for the girl from Alabama, who had once looked toward the horizon with such longing. That girl, perhaps, had never truly vanished, but she was buried beneath layers of laughter, excess, and myth. The contrast between her public and private selves grew sharper with time. On stage and in interviews, she remained dazzling, unrestrained, the woman who mocked propriety and claimed her own freedom. But in private, her body grew frail, her heart ached with loss, and her spirit wearied under the weight of her own legend. It is one thing to play a role for 2 hours upon the stage. It is another to play a role unceasingly in life itself. Tallulah had chosen, or perhaps been forced, to live as her own performance, and in time the performance consumed her strength. And yet her sorrows were rarely shown openly. She carried them with the same audacity as she carried her scandals, transforming even grief into theater. When asked about her miscarriages, she made jokes so outrageous that interviewers hesitated to print them. When her health faltered, she mocked her own body with the same sharpness she used upon others. When loneliness pressed upon her, she filled her house with laughter, inviting company to banish silence. In this way, she turned sorrow into spectacle, but the wounds remained, hidden beneath the costume of wit. It is tempting to imagine what she might have been had she lived in a world less harsh, less judgmental, less hungry for scandal. Would she have found contentment in a quieter life, with family and rest, with love unburdened by performance? Or was her restlessness too deeply woven, her hunger for freedom too fierce for such peace? The answers remain uncertain, for Tallulah herself was a woman of contradictions, yearning for intimacy, yet fleeing from confinement, longing for permanence, yet burning every bridge she crossed. Still, those who knew her closely spoke not only of her wit and her scandal, but also of her kindness, her generosity, her capacity to comfort others even while carrying her own grief. She supported younger actors, encouraged friends, gave freely of her wealth when others were in need. In her private sorrows, she remained fiercely human, refusing to allow pain to harden her entirely. Perhaps it was this humanity, glimpsed behind the mask, that made her beloved even by those she wounded. The sound of rain against a window often accompanied her private hours, tapping softly against glass as though echoing her unspoken thoughts. She would sit, cigarette smoke curling upward, the applause of the night before still faint in her memory, the laughter of friends already faded. Outside, the city hummed with life, but inside was only the sound of rain and the steady awareness of absence. It was in such moments, more than in the glare of cameras or the heat of the stage, that the truth of Tallulah Bankhead revealed itself. A woman both fierce and fragile, both free and bound, both adored and alone. The rain continued, tapping gently, unresolved, as though time itself lingered in hesitation, unwilling to move forward, unwilling to let the silence deepen. The rain tapped softly against the window, each drop a tiny percussion against glass, as though time itself were counting moments that could not be reclaimed. In that gentle rhythm, Tallulah's solitude found an echo, but she did not surrender to silence for long. When the rain paused, when the curtain of water grew thin, her voice rose again, sharp as ever, wielded like a blade. For if sorrow pursued her, she would answer it not with tears but with words. And those words, biting, dazzling, unforgettable, were her chosen weapon. Her wit had always been her shield, but in the later years it became her sword as well, cutting through the pity she despised, silencing those who would reduce her to decline. Friends, critics, strangers alike knew that to stand in Tallulah's company was to risk becoming the subject of her tongue. She delivered insults with such grace that they landed like compliments, jokes with such outrageousness that they became legends before the night was over. No matter her health, no matter her private grief, her tongue remained sharp, her mind unrelenting, her humor unbowed. Consider the dressing room she inhabited, where nervous young actors gathered like moths around her flame. They sought wisdom, approval, perhaps even affection, and Tallulah gave it in riddles of wit. To one who stammered, she might say, "Darling, speak quickly, before the critics catch up with your hesitation." To another who worried about appearance, she declared, "Don't fret, my dear, the audience will be too busy looking at me." These remarks, cruel on the surface, carried a strange generosity beneath, for they taught resilience, the art of laughing at oneself before the world had the chance to wound. Her quips filled newspapers, but they also filled rooms with laughter that was not always comfortable. She mocked friends at their own tables, teased lovers in public, ridiculed the mighty with a smile that disarmed them. When invited to the White House, she scandalized polite society with remarks so outrageous that even the dignitaries laughed despite themselves. She seemed to live by the creed that truth wrapped in jest was the most irresistible form of rebellion. And yet her wit was not only for others, it was turned most fiercely upon herself. She joked about her drinking, her addictions, her failures, her fading beauty. "I'll come and make love to your wife," she once told a friend, "but be sure to leave the lights on so I can do my makeup." Such self-mockery was more than humor. It was survival. By laughing at her own flaws, she claimed them, stripped them of their sting, and transformed them into performance. She would not let the world pity her, for pity was more unbearable than scandal. Better to be laughed at with her than wept over without her. Still, wit, as weapon, carried its dangers. Friends grew weary of being the targets of her tongue, lovers wounded by jokes that revealed too much truth. Some drifted away, unable to withstand the constant edge of her humor. Her relationships, already fragile, were further strained by her refusal to soften her words. She knew this, yet she rarely restrained herself, for restraint felt to her like surrender. She would rather lose friends than silence her voice, for her voice was her essence, her defiance against the silence that had haunted her since birth. Her wit also became her legacy. Stories of her remarks multiplied, repeated, reshaped, becoming part of theatrical folklore. Some were true, some exaggerated, some invented entirely, but all carried the flavor of Tallulah, audacious, irreverent, unforgettable. Long after a play had closed, long after a film had faded from memory, her words remained, passed from mouth to mouth like treasures of mischief. She had, in her way, carved immortality from language itself. But what of the woman behind the wit? Did the blade ever wound herself? In quiet hours after the laughter subsided, perhaps the sharpness turned inward, cutting into her own spirit. Wit can defend, but it can also isolate, leaving tenderness unsaid, vulnerability hidden behind endless jokes. One wonders if she ever longed for someone with whom she did not need to jest, someone before whom she could be silent without fear. If such a person existed, they remained rare, for most who approached her encountered the dazzling, dangerous shield of her tongue. And yet, there were glimpses of gentleness, small moments when her humor softened into affection, when her laughter carried warmth rather than mockery. Friends recalled her generosity, her kindness to those struggling, her encouragement of younger artists. Beneath the weapon there was still a heart capable of compassion, though she rarely allowed the world to see it unguarded. As her career waned and her health declined, her wit did not fade. Indeed, it seemed to sharpen, as though the less she could command with her body, the more fiercely she wielded her voice. Interviews late in her life still carried the same outrageous candor, the same refusal to bow before propriety. She laughed at death as she laughed at life, mocking even her own decline. "If I had to live my life again," she once said, "I'd make all the same mistakes, only sooner." The theater, long her home, bore witness to this weapon of words. There were nights when audiences came not only to see her act, but to hear her speak, to bask in the unpredictable brilliance of her remarks, whether scripted or improvised. She blurred the line between role and self until it seemed impossible to know where Tallulah the actress ended and Tallulah the wit began. And so, in her final years of glory, when her body weakened and her voice grew raspy, her wit remained her power. It kept her in the public eye, kept her name alive, kept her legend growing. It was both her shield against sorrow and her sword against obscurity. With it, she carved her place in memory, ensuring that even as the applause faded, the laughter she provoked would echo on. The last sound after the laughter subsided was often a silence heavy with her absence, an empty theater echoing faintly with a final laugh that seemed to linger, unresolved, waiting for someone to answer. The final laugh echoed through the empty theater, lingering in the rafters like a ghost reluctant to depart. And in that space between sound and silence, another chapter of Tallulah's life emerged. A time when the laughter of audiences gave way to the marching of boots and the droning of engines overhead. For the world itself had shifted into war, and even those most devoted to scandal and stage could not remain untouched. Tallulah Bankhead, ever restless, carried her voice and her presence into that turbulent time, giving herself to the strange marriage of patriotism and performance. When World War II broke upon the world, actors and actresses found themselves drawn into the effort, not with rifles, but with words, music, and spectacle. Tallulah, who had long played queen and jester upon the stage, now turned herself toward a different audience. The soldiers who faced the weight of conflict and the citizens who endured the uncertainty of bombs and rationing. It might seem strange to think of a woman so often associated with excess and scandal stepping into the role of comforter, but Tallulah, with her husky voice and unrestrained spirit, was uniquely suited to it. She gave to the war years what she'd always given: laughter, irreverence, and presence, and in the darkness of that time, it mattered more than ever. She traveled to entertain troops, her voice carrying across makeshift stages and barracks and camps, her wit cutting through the gloom of waiting soldiers. Imagine her, cigarette in hand, gown trailing across dusty ground, standing before men who had seen death or were about to face it, and saying something so outrageous, so audacious, that laughter erupted like a sudden flame. In that moment, for those men, she was not merely an actress, she was defiance itself, a reminder that life, absurd and scandalous, still existed beyond the shadow of war. Her patriotism was sincere. She may have mocked authority, scorned convention, and scandalized polite society, but she loved her country deeply. She supported Roosevelt's administration, lent her voice to broadcasts, urging unity and resilience, and gave generously of her time and energy. In radio programs designed to lift morale, her voice was unmistakable, its smoky tones carrying across the Atlantic, a voice that said, in essence, "We are still here. We are still laughing. We are still alive." There is something poignant in her contribution, for war strips away pretense, and yet Tallulah's very essence was pretense turned into art. Perhaps that was why she could bring relief. She did not pretend the world was safe. She did not offer solemn speeches or noble restraint. She offered herself as scandalous and irreverent as ever, and in that offering there was comfort. To soldiers far from home, her voice reminded them of freedom, of the absurdity of life beyond uniforms and battlefields. She was, in her own way, a soldier too, though her weapon was laughter. In London during the Blitz, she performed despite the dangers, her voice ringing through theaters, even as bombs fell upon the city. Audiences came not only for the plays, but for the sheer defiance of gathering together in the face of destruction. Tallulah, with her wildness and her courage, embodied that spirit of resilience. She would not be silenced by war, and by refusing silence, she encouraged others to do the same. The theater, fragile and temporary, became a sanctuary where laughter rose louder than sirens, if only for an hour. Her wartime service was not without controversy. She continued to drink, continued to speak with candor that shocked officials, continued to live as herself in an era that demanded conformity and discipline. But these very traits made her contributions memorable. She was not a figurehead draped in patriotic slogans. She was Tallulah Bankhead, unchanged and unrestrained, and for that reason she seemed more authentic, more real. She reminded people that freedom meant not only survival, but also the right to be outrageous, to mock solemnity, to embrace joy even in the darkest hours. The soldiers adored her. They remembered her not only for the roles she played, but for the moments she stood before them, joking, smoking, flirting, laughing, as though she were one of them. Some carried her photographs, some repeated her lines, some told stories of the nights when Tallulah came to their camp and made them forget war for an evening. To them, she was not merely a star. She was a memory of life beyond death, a reminder that beauty and scandal still had a place in a world that seemed determined to erase them. It is worth wondering whether Tallulah herself found a kind of redemption in these years. For once, her scandal served not only herself, but others. Her laughter not merely a mask for her own sorrow, but a gift that lifted spirits. Perhaps in entertaining soldiers and standing defiantly on bomb-shaken stages, she found a purpose deeper than applause, a role greater than any script had offered her. In war, she discovered that her very outrageousness could become a form of courage. Still, war leaves its marks. She witnessed destruction. She felt the exhaustion of travel. She carried the weight of performing not for art, but for survival. When the war ended, she returned to America with both pride and weariness, her name further burnished by her service, her legend enriched with tales of defiance in the face of bombs. Yet the restlessness remained. She could not linger in patriotism or solemnity for long. Once again she sought the stage, the laughter, the scandal, as though war had been only another act in the great drama of her life. The hum of planes that once filled the skies gradually faded into memory, leaving behind silence broken only by voices recalling what had been endured. For Tallulah, that hum became part of her story, a reminder that even in war she had refused silence. She had laughed, spoken, scandalized, entertained, and in doing so had left her mark not only upon stages but upon hearts weary of conflict. The distant hum of planes still lingers in the imagination, unresolved, as though fading into silence but never vanishing entirely. The hum of planes faded slowly into quiet, their sound dissolving into the distance, and in that silence another kind of voice began to rise. Voices carried not through the roar of engines or the gathering of theater crowds, but through invisible waves that stretched into homes, into kitchens and parlors, into the ears of people who had never seen her on a stage. For the war had ended, and with its passing came a new age of communication, and Tallulah Bankhead, whose husky voice had always seemed born to linger, now found herself drawn into the realms of radio, and later the flickering new light of television. It was perhaps inevitable that her voice, more memorable than her face to many, would find its home in radio. The airwaves carried her tone, smoky and commanding, across distances far greater than any theater could hold. She was invited to host programs, to perform in adaptations of plays, to banter with guests who struggled to match her wit. Radio was intimate in a way the stage could never be. There was no applause, no crowd, only the listener alone with her voice. And in that intimacy, Tallulah thrived. Her sharp remarks seemed even sharper when whispered directly into the ear, her laughter more mischievous, her confessions more scandalous. Listeners who had never seen her on Broadway now knew her as though she were a guest in their homes. One of her most celebrated ventures was the variety program, The Big Show, which she hosted in the early 1950s. The program was grand in design, featuring music, comedy, and drama, and Tallulah at its center, introducing acts, trading barbs with stars, keeping the entire spectacle alive with her presence. She was unpredictable, often outrageous, sometimes too candid for the censors, but always compelling. Audiences tuned in not only for the performances, but to hear what Tallulah would say next. Her voice filled living rooms across America, a reminder that scandal and wit could travel as easily through wires as across stages. Yet radio, though powerful, was soon overshadowed by the rise of television, and Tallulah, restless as ever, stepped into that world as well. The small screen, still new and uncertain, became another stage for her to conquer, or at least to haunt. She appeared on talk shows, variety hours, dramatic programs, her face now as familiar as her voice. The camera, once her uneasy companion in Hollywood films, now seemed more forgiving. Age had softened her features, but the fire in her eyes remained, and television audiences discovered in her a presence that could not be contained by the modest frames of their screens. She sparred with hosts, teased guests, and turned interviews into performances. On shows like The Ed Sullivan Show and The Tonight Show, she delivered lines that left audiences gasping or laughing, depending on their tolerance for her candor. She smoked on air. She joked about her vices. She scandalized with her confessions. Where other stars sought to polish their image for television's broad audiences, Tallulah refused polish. She brought to the new medium the same audacity she had carried into theaters and war zones. She was herself, unrestrained, daring, and unforgettable. Her ventures into television drama were less consistent. She appeared in guest roles, often playing characters who mirrored her own reputation. Grand, defiant, unpredictable women whose sharp tongues cut through every scene. In some ways she was typecast, but in others she embraced it. After all, Tallulah had always blurred the line between herself and her roles. If television wanted Tallulah the scandalous diva, Tallulah would give it precisely that, and more. Still, there was a poignancy in these years. The stage had always been her true home, and radio and television, for all their reach, could not replicate the living pulse of an audience. She sometimes confessed that she missed the immediate reaction, the energy of applause, the shared silence before a line, and the eruption of laughter after it. Television was distant, impersonal, even as it brought her into more homes than theater ever could. She accepted it, but it never wholly satisfied her restless spirit. Yet radio and television gave her something the stage could not: endurance. Her voice, her image, her presence were now recorded, preserved, repeated. She became a constant figure in American households, not merely a star of Broadway or Hollywood, but a personality whose scandal and wit belonged to the nation at large. In an era when mass media shaped culture more than theater ever had, she carved her place not as a traditional actress, but as something rarer, a living legend, broadcast nightly into the homes of millions. Of course, her old habits followed her. She drank before broadcasts, sometimes during them. She smoked so constantly that producers worried for their sets and censors worried for their reputations. She quipped about her own decline, mocking the very programs she appeared on. She could exasperate directors with her unpredictability, yet they tolerated it, for audiences adored her. Even when she stumbled, she remained fascinating, and in the world of entertainment, fascination was often more valuable than perfection. In these years, her myth grew beyond the confines of theater and film. She became part of the cultural fabric, quoted in magazines, imitated by younger performers, referenced in plays and films. Her voice itself became a symbol of defiance, of decadence, of a woman who refused to be silenced. For audiences weary of conformity, she was both scandal and liberation. Yet, as always, the shadow lingered. Fame carried her forward, but loneliness and ill health pursued her still. Her presence on the airwaves masked the reality of her declining strength, the toll of decades of excess, the weariness of a woman who had played herself for so long that she could not find rest. She laughed, she bantered, she entertained, but when the microphone switched off, when the camera light dimmed, the silence returned, heavier than before. Still, the legacy of those years endures. Tallulah Bankhead on radio and television was more than an actress adapting to new mediums. She was a pioneer of presence, a proof that personality itself could be art, that scandal could become spectacle, that wit could survive translation into any form. Her voice, once echoing only in theaters, now became part of the memory of a generation, a sound that comforted, shocked, amused, and lingered. The crackle of the radio remained after her broadcast ended, faint static unresolved, as though the air itself was unwilling to let her voice fully fade. The faint static lingered after her broadcasts ended, that soft hiss of emptiness where once her voice had filled the air, and into that hush crept the truth of years lived without restraint. Tallulah Bankhead had built her legend upon audacity, upon laughter louder than judgment, upon indulgence carried with defiant pride. Yet every excess demands its price, and in time the bill arrives quietly, without applause, like a mirror clouding with breath. Her health, never strong, grew fragile beneath the weight of decades of cigarettes, liquor, and restless nights. She smoked so endlessly that friends joked her very veins must have been lined with nicotine, though beneath the humor was fear. She drank with such abandon that her body began to betray her, weary organs faltering under the strain. She had long mocked the warnings of doctors, turning them into jokes that made reporters laugh, but behind closed doors the consequences grew harder to disguise. Bronchitis deepened into emphysema, her voice once velvet and smoke becoming gravel and rasp. She collapsed more than once, carried from parties or theaters into the care of physicians who urged her to slow. Yet slowing down was the one thing Tallulah could never do. Her beauty, too, bore the marks of excess. The wide eyes that once glittered beneath lights grew shadowed, the skin drawn thin, the figure frail. Makeup could disguise, gowns could flatter, but those who looked closely saw the toll. Photographs from later years show her with a strange mixture of defiance and fatigue, as though she dared the world to notice her decline, even while she masked it in style. She joked about her appearance, told stories of her wasted mornings, laughed at the very notion of aging gracefully. Grace had never been her way. Defiance was, and so she turned even decay into spectacle, refusing to let sorrow write her ending. But it was not only the body that faltered. Reputation, too, bore the cost. Producers hesitated to cast her, fearing unreliability, fearing scandal would overshadow performance. Some plays that might have suited her never came. Some films slipped away. Younger actresses emerged, polished and obedient, capturing the roles that once might have been hers. Tallulah's legend remained, but her opportunities dwindled. She was loved, remembered, admired. but she was no longer indispensable to the stage or the screen. The world of entertainment, always hungry for novelty, began to turn its gaze elsewhere, leaving her to fight for relevance in an industry that had once bowed to her. She did not surrender easily. She returned to the stage whenever possible, even when her health faltered, even when critics muttered of decline. She hosted radio and television with vigor, even when her voice cracked and her wit grew weary. She appeared at parties, dazzling still, even when her body longed for rest. But the price of defiance was isolation, for behind the laughter, others saw the cracks. Friends worried, lovers drifted, colleagues grew cautious. She was still adored, but now also pitied, and pity was the one thing she had always feared most. What is the cost of living without restraint? For some, it is freedom. For others, it is ruin. For Tallulah, it was both. She had lived as few women dared, embracing scandal, defying convention, claiming desire and wit as her weapons. She had made herself unforgettable, her very name a synonym for audacity. Yet the same choices that built her legend consumed her health, eroded her art, and left her weary. The mirror, clouded with breath, showed not only the woman she had become, but also the cost of the woman she had always been. Still, even as the price mounted, she refused regret. She declared in interviews that she would not change her choices, that she had lived fully, outrageously, as herself. And perhaps that was true. Perhaps to regret would be to deny the essence of her life, for Tallulah Bankhead was never meant to be ordinary, never meant to live quietly or die discreetly. She embraced excess because it was her nature, and though it consumed her, it also ensured her immortality. There are stories of her in later years, sitting before a mirror clouded with smoke, her reflection blurred, her eyes lined with fatigue, and yet still she laughed. She spoke of her sins as though they were trophies, her scars as though they were jewels. She claimed the ruin as part of the art, the decline as part of the performance. And in a sense, she was right. For the legend of Tallulah was not of a perfect actress or a saintly woman, but of a life lived defiantly, dangerously, without apology. The price of excess was heavy, but it was also the currency of her myth. The mirror clouded further, her breath upon glass fading into vapor, unresolved, leaving behind the shadow of a face that once commanded stages and screens alike, a face both diminished and defiant. The mirror clouded with breath, its surface blurred by vapor that drifted slowly into nothingness, and behind that fading mist stood a woman who had once commanded stages with fire. Though her body faltered and her health betrayed her, Tallulah Bankhead could never entirely leave the theater, for it was not only her profession, but her truest home. The boards beneath her feet, the velvet curtain that rose and fell, the silence of an audience waiting, these were woven into her being. And so, even as the years pressed upon her, she returned again and again to the stage, seeking in performance a revival of the self she could not abandon. Her comebacks were met with anticipation, tinged with doubt. Critics wondered whether she could still command, whether her voice would hold, whether her presence could burn as it once had. Audiences came not only to witness the play, but to witness her, to see if the Tallulah of legend still lived within the woman grown frail. And when the lights fell upon her, there was no denying it. Though her strength was waning, her charisma remained, undimmed. She might stumble, she might falter, her lines might rasp through breath, made shallow by cigarettes and illness, but the essence of her presence remained. She had only to step into the light, and the room was hers. One of her most notable late roles was as Sabina in Thornton Wilder's The Skin of Our Teeth, where her wildness suited a character that embodied chaos itself. She infused the part with her trademark audacity, turning the play into a reflection of herself, unpredictable, irreverent, larger than the text itself. Audiences laughed, gasped, admired, and though critics were divided, they agreed on one point. No one could play Tallulah Bankhead but Tallulah Bankhead. Even in decline, she was singular. Her final performances carried a poignancy that had not marked her earlier triumphs. The husky voice, once seductive, now rasped with strain. The figure that once commanded desire now trembled with fragility. And yet these very marks of time added depth. She was no longer merely the scandalous beauty, no longer only the defiant wit. She was also the survivor, the woman who had lived fully and now bore the weight of her years openly. In her performances, audiences saw not only characters, but the story of Tallulah herself, a story of brilliance and ruin, laughter and sorrow. There were moments when the audience, aware of her struggles, offered not only applause but something more tender, respect, compassion, a recognition of what it meant to give oneself to art even when the body rebelled. She stood before them, fragile and fierce, and in that contradiction lay her enduring power. For Tallulah had always embodied contradiction, and now, in her final performances, she embraced it fully. Backstage, the effort was greater. Friends recalled her exhaustion, her coughs racking her body, her reliance on stimulants to sustain energy and on sedatives to find rest. She pushed herself beyond reason, refusing to surrender, refusing to let silence claim her. The theater was both her sanctuary and her battlefield, and she fought upon it to the end. Some nights she triumphed, others she faltered, but always she remained unforgettable. Television and radio appearances continued alongside her stage work, though increasingly they became spectacles of personality rather than showcases of acting. She was invited onto programs not only to perform, but to be herself, to deliver her outrageous lines, to remind audiences of the Tallulah they adored. Even when her health was visibly failing, even when her energy waned, she refused to retreat from public view. She seemed determined that if decline was to come, it would come beneath lights, with her laughter still echoing. The courage in this should not be underestimated. To step before an audience knowing the body may betray, knowing critics may scorn, knowing whispers of decline will follow, requires a defiance few can summon. Tallulah did so again and again, not because she sought redemption, but because performance was inseparable from her being. She could not live without the stage any more than she could live without air. Yet, as with all comebacks, the triumphs were fleeting. The applause faded, the critics wrote their lines, and she returned to rooms where silence pressed heavy. Each performance left her weaker, and the strain upon her body grew unbearable. Still, she planned new roles, spoke of new projects, dreamed of returns that her health would not allow. The stage was always ahead of her, like a horizon she continued to chase, even as her strength diminished. There is a haunting image of her in those later years, standing in a dim spotlight, her gown shimmering though her body trembled beneath it, her voice hoarse yet commanding. Yet, the audience, aware of her fragility, held its breath, sensing that what they witnessed was not merely a play but the final fire of a woman who had lived too brightly to fade quietly. In that moment, applause was not only for the role but for the life, for the defiance, for the courage to stand unbowed even as the curtain of mortality drew nearer. The spotlight dimmed, flickered, but did not go dark. It lingered upon her as though reluctant to let her go, unresolved, casting her figure half in shadow, half in light, suspended between triumph and farewell. The spotlight dimmed and flickered, clinging to her figure as though unwilling to let her pass fully into shadow. And in that trembling light, one could almost glimpse not the legend, not the scandal, not the wit sharpened into steel, but the woman who had lived beneath it all. For Tallulah Bankhead, whose life had been performance from childhood to curtain call, was not only myth but mortal, a creature of longing, of fragility, of contradictions too human to be erased by the laughter she inspired. When the light wavered, when the audience departed, when the rooms fell silent, the myth faded and the woman remained. In private spaces, away from the roar of applause, Tallulah was often different from the firebrand of interviews and parties. Friends who knew her closely spoke of moments of gentleness, of a generosity that seemed boundless, of a vulnerability that she rarely allowed to surface before strangers. She could listen with surprising tenderness, offering comfort with the same voice that could just as easily slice with sarcasm. She gave freely of her wealth, supporting younger actors, sending funds to those in need, extending kindness to those the world overlooked. She was not only scandal and excess, she was also capable of quiet acts of grace that never reached the newspapers. Her vulnerability, however, was most apparent in solitude. In the fading evenings of her later years, she often sat alone in rooms, scented faintly of perfume and smoke, the echo of laughter lingering but no longer alive. She surrounded herself with relics, photographs, letters, souvenirs from performances long past, tokens of a life lived at full blaze. These objects were not trophies so much as companions, silent reminders of the girl who had left Alabama, of the woman who had conquered London, of the queen who had ruled Broadway. Yet they were also reminders of times passing, of lovers gone, of friends departed, of triumphs now memories. She carried regrets more quietly than she admitted. She had joked so often about her miscarriages, about her childlessness, that many assumed she felt nothing. But beneath the bravado, the loss remained raw. She adored the company of children, doted on the sons and daughters of her friends, yet her own house remained empty of small footsteps and lullabies. That emptiness followed her, a sorrow she transformed into laughter when others asked. But in solitude it lingered, unresolved. Her relationships, too, left their scars. For all her passion and openness, she struggled to find lasting companionship. Lovers adored her brilliance, but many could not endure the chaos of her world, the constant push and pull of affection and wit, intimacy and mockery. Friends remained, but even they sometimes retreated, exhausted by her excesses. Tallulah longed for closeness, yet often drove it away with the very armor she wore to protect herself. In this, she was both fierce and fragile, both desperate for love and afraid of it. The myth of Tallulah Bankhead was of a woman who lived without restraint, who laughed at propriety, who mocked morality, who embodied freedom. But the woman herself knew the cost of such freedom. She knew the loneliness that trailed behind nights of revelry, the emptiness left after applause faded, the toll exacted by indulgence. She spoke rarely of these truths, but they lived in her, shaping her every jest, every scandal, every reckless act. Behind the myth was a soul not unlike any other, longing for love, haunted by absence, seeking meaning in the chaos. In these later years, her humanity became more visible. Age softened the edges of her defiance, though never erasing it. She still mocked, still shocked, still laughed louder than others, but the world also glimpsed the woman who grew tired, who coughed after every cigarette, who needed help to rise from her chair. There was poignancy in this sight, for it revealed what had always been true. The legend was built upon a mortal frame, fragile and fleeting. And yet, even in vulnerability, she remained herself. She never fully surrendered to pity, never allowed sorrow to claim her voice entirely. She continued to live with the same audacity, even when her strength waned. She told stories of her past with laughter, turning grief into performance, transforming loss into legend. She embraced her contradictions, never seeking to reconcile them, for she knew that it was in contradiction that she truly lived. There is an image of her in these years that lingers, sitting at a dressing table after a performance, the room dimly lit, the scent of powder and perfume still heavy in the air. She leans forward, staring into the mirror, her reflection blurred by a haze of smoke. Around her, costumes hang, makeup brushes lie scattered, flowers from admirers fade in their vases. She touches her own cheek, lined now with years, and smiles faintly, as though amused by the passage of time. In that moment, she is not Tallulah the scandal, nor Tallulah the wit, nor Tallulah the star. She is simply Tallulah, a woman who has lived fiercely and who, in quiet solitude, faces herself with honesty. The scent of faded perfume lingers in the empty room long after she has left it, unresolved, drifting like memory through the air, reminding one that behind every myth lies a mortal heart. The scent of faded perfume lingered in the empty room, clinging to the curtains and the silence as though unwilling to vanish. And from that fragile fragrance emerged the final act of Tallulah Bankhead's life. By the late 1960s, her body, worn by years of indulgence and the relentless pace of her legend, could no longer carry the weight of her spirit. The woman who had once ruled Broadway, scandalized Hollywood, and filled the airwaves with her husky voice, now lived in a state of frailty that stood in stark contrast to the fire she had embodied. Yet even in decline, she remained Tallulah, unbowed, refusing to surrender fully to sorrow or pity. Her final years were marked by illness. Emphysema gripped her lungs, each breath a struggle, each cigarette another act of defiance. Her frame grew thinner, her once commanding presence diminished to fragility, but her wit did not falter. Visitors recalled her rasping jokes even from her sickbed, her laughter cracking through coughs, her sharp tongue reminding all that though her body failed, her voice remained fierce. She mocked her decline as she had mocked her excesses, turning weakness into performance, refusing to let death strip her of her greatest weapon. She lived in New York, surrounded still by mementos of her career, photographs of herself in triumph, gifts from admirers, letters yellowed with age. The room smelled of smoke, of powder, of that faint perfume that seemed to cling to her as much as to her possessions. Friends came and went, some to comfort, some to witness the final days of a legend. She greeted them with the same mix of warmth and irreverence that had always defined her, sometimes tender, sometimes outrageous, always unforgettable. On December 12, 1968, the curtain fell. Tallulah Bankhead died at the age of 66. Her final words, reportedly whispered to the nurses at her side, "Codeine, bourbon." It was a fitting epitaph, a final line that captured her life of indulgence and wit, a line that was both tragic and comic, both human and mythic. News of her death spread quickly, filling newspapers and airwaves. The obituaries poured out, some reverent, some scandal-tinged, all acknowledging that a singular figure had departed. The world responded with a mixture of mourning and fascination. Broadway dimmed its lights in tribute, honoring the woman who had ruled its stages with unmatched audacity. Hollywood, though it had never fully embraced her, acknowledged her as one of its wildest and most unforgettable spirits. Critics who had once scorned her excesses now wrote with admiration of her courage, her talent, her refusal to conform. Admirers remembered her wit, her presence, the moments when she had made them laugh in the midst of sorrow. Even those who had condemned her in life spoke of her with a kind of reluctant reverence, as though recognizing that her scandal itself had been a form of defiance worthy of respect. Her funeral drew friends, actors, politicians, admirers from all corners of her life. They gathered to pay tribute to a woman who had defied every convention and left behind a legend impossible to erase. Some wept, some laughed as they recalled her outrageous remarks. Some whispered still of her lovers and scandals, for even in death, Tallulah remained both revered and gossiped about. The mixture of reverence and scandal defined her even as she was laid to rest, as though the two could never be separated in her memory. What does it mean for a star to die? For most, it is the extinguishing of light, the end of brilliance. But for Tallulah, death did not end her legend. It only deepened it. The woman was gone, but the myth remained, carried in stories, in laughter, in the countless quotes and anecdotes that survived her. She had lived in such a way that memory itself could not let her vanish quietly. Even in death, she remained larger than life, her voice echoing through time. And yet, behind the obituaries, behind the tributes, behind the final jokes, there was still the human being, a woman who had been born in Alabama, who had lost her mother before she could know her, who had longed for love and children, who had battled loneliness even as she surrounded herself with admirers. The myth of Tallulah Bankhead was scandal and wit, but the truth of Tallulah was more tender, more fragile, more human. To mourn her fully is to remember both, the legend who defied the world and the woman who carried sorrow quietly within her. Her death left a silence that no quip could fill. For those who had known her, the absence was profound, the void left by a voice that had filled rooms with laughter and defiance for decades. For the world at large, the silence was filled quickly with stories, with retellings of her outrageous life, with new myths built upon old truths. She had wanted above all to be unforgettable, and in this, she succeeded. Tallulah Bankhead may have died in 1968, but she did not fade. Her legend endured, alive in memory, in words, in laughter that still echoed long after her final breath. The theater where she had so often reigned stood silent that evening, its curtain drawn, its stage empty, the air heavy with remembrance. The silence was itself a kind of applause, a recognition that the star had gone but the light remained. And in that silence one could still hear, faintly, the echo of her voice, husky and defiant, lingering unresolved like a final line, waiting for its reply. The theater stood silent, its curtain drawn, the stage empty yet heavy with the weight of presence. And in that stillness the transformation began. For with Tallulah Bankhead, death did not close the story, but rather invited its retelling, reshaping, exaggerating, weaving the fragile threads of truth into the more enduring fabric of myth. A legend is rarely faithful to the life it springs from, yet in Tallulah's case, the legend was already alive long before her final breath. Her memory, scattered through anecdotes, photographs, recordings, and the whispers of those who had known her, became a kind of living mythos, equal parts admiration and scandal, reverence and mockery, all inseparable. Obituaries tried to capture her, but each in its way faltered. Some declared her a great actress, one of the brightest stars of her generation. Others remembered her more for her wit, her outrageous remarks, the stories that seemed to follow her like perfume. Some emphasized her excesses, her drinking, her affairs, her addictions, while others wrote of her courage, her generosity, her service during the war. None could capture her fully, for Tallulah herself had refused such capture in life. She was too many things at once, too contradictory, too shifting between mask and truth. To write of her was to glimpse only a part, never the whole. In the years that followed, her myth grew. Stories of her wildness were repeated until they became folklore, embellished with each telling. Did she really arrive at a party wearing nothing beneath her fur coat? Did she truly announce in a crowded room her conquests of men and women alike? Did she in fact utter every outrageous line attributed to her? Perhaps, perhaps not. The truth mattered less than the telling, for the myth of Tallulah was itself a kind of theater, a story told and retold until it seemed more real than reality. She had lived her life as a performance, and in memory that performance continued, embroidered by those who loved her and those who merely loved to talk about her. Critics and historians debated her place in art. Some argued she squandered her gifts, that her excess overshadowed her true talent, that she could have been greater had she been more disciplined. Others countered that her greatness lay not only in her roles, but in her very being, that she had redefined what it meant to be a woman on stage and in society, refusing silence, refusing propriety, demanding the right to live outrageously. To reduce her to failures was to misunderstand her essence, for her life itself was her masterpiece, lived at a pitch most dared not attempt. For younger generations, she became a symbol of defiance, a name invoked whenever wit cut through hypocrisy or scandal challenged convention. Playwrights remembered her, actors imitated her, comedians quoted her. Even those who had never seen her perform knew her name, for it had become shorthand for audacity. In the gay community especially, she became an icon, celebrated for her openness, her rejection of shame, her embrace of desire beyond boundaries. She had lived in a time when such candor was dangerous, and yet she spoke it openly, defiantly, transforming her life into an anthem of freedom. And yet, alongside admiration, her memory carried tragedy. The image of her frail body, her fading voice, her final years marked by illness and decline, haunted those who had known her. They remembered not only the wit, but also the loneliness, not only the scandal, but also the sorrow. To recall Tallulah fully was to recall both, the brilliance and the shadows, the laughter and the silence. For myth may enlarge, but it also simplifies, and the truth of Tallulah lay in contradiction. She was at once triumphant and broken, adored and pitied, fearless and afraid. In time, photographs grew yellow, voices recorded on brittle discs crackled with age, stories slipped from first-hand accounts into second-hand legends. A faded photograph left in a drawer became the relic of memory, its edges curled, its image soft, yet still carrying the unmistakable spark of her eyes. Someone opening that drawer years later might pause, struck by the gaze of a woman long gone yet not forgotten, a gaze that seemed to mock even time itself. For if memory softens, myth preserves, and Tallulah had ensured she would belong as much to myth as to history. One wonders how she herself would wish to be remembered. As a great actress? As a wit? As a scandal? As a woman who defied her age? Perhaps all of these, perhaps none. Perhaps she would prefer only that she not be forgotten, that her name still be spoken, her voice still imitated, her laughter still recalled. If so, she succeeded. For though the curtain had long since fallen, Tallulah Bankhead remained alive in memory, her story told and retold, her myth carried forward like the lingering scent of perfume in an empty room. The photograph, left in the drawer, rested quietly, unresolved, its image half shadow, half light, waiting for the hand that might one day lift it into memory again. The photograph rested quietly in the drawer, its edges curled, its colors fading into sepia, and yet within that still image her eyes seemed to glimmer with the same restless mischief that had once unsettled and enchanted audiences. A gaze caught in paper, half shadow and half light, waiting for someone to pause, to remember, to wonder. And so, in this last reflection, we return to the essence of Tallulah Bankhead, not merely the actress, not only the scandal, but the woman who lived as few dared to live, reckless and radiant, her very being a defiance against silence. Her story, traced across the arc of nearly 7 decades, is not easily contained. Born into privilege yet haunted by loss, she rose from Alabama to London, from Broadway to Hollywood, leaving behind trails of laughter, of rumors, of triumphs and collapses. She conquered and she faltered. She dazzled and she wounded. She gave herself to audiences and lovers and friends, and yet always remained in some corner unknowable. To recount her life is to move through light and shadow, for she was never only one thing. She was brilliance and ruin, courage and weakness, freedom and captivity, all entwined in one restless spirit. What, then, do we learn from such a life? Perhaps not lessons, for Tallulah herself would laugh at the idea of being reduced to a moral. But there are reflections. She reminds us that to live fully is to risk greatly, that to embrace desire and wit and audacity is to invite both admiration and judgment. She shows us that scandal, when carried with defiance, can become not shame, but power. And she reveals, too, the cost of such living, the toll upon the body, the loneliness that follows laughter, the decline that no wit can wholly disguise. Tallulah's freedom was radical for her age, at a time when women were expected to be silent, modest, obedient. She spoke loudly, lived openly, loved across boundaries, mocked propriety to its face. In this, she became more than an actress. She became a symbol of possibility. Even those who condemned her secretly recognized in her the freedom they themselves longed for. She embodied the dream of living without restraint, though she also bore the consequences. Her life was both liberation and warning, a reminder that to burn brightly is also to burn briefly. And yet, would she have chosen otherwise? She often said she would not, that she would make the same mistakes again, only sooner. Perhaps she knew that without the excess, without the scandal, without the laughter too loud for polite rooms, she would not have been Tallulah. To live cautiously, to live quietly, would have been a kind of death for her long before the end. Better to drink deeply, to laugh scandalously, to love recklessly, to perform outrageously, even if it meant paying dearly. Her life, in this sense, was not a tragedy, but a testament to the courage of being fully oneself, no matter the cost. In the decades since her death, her memory has not faded. She lives on in the lines attributed to her, in the plays that recall her performances, in the stories repeated by those who knew her and those who only wish they had. She lives on as an icon of wit, of defiance, of a woman who refused to bow to convention, and though her body rests in silence, her voice still lingers, husky and daring, as though echoing across time, mocking propriety, mocking even death itself. As we close her story, it is perhaps best to leave not with certainty, but with questions, for questions are the truest way to honor a life lived in contradiction. Was Tallulah's wildness a mask for sorrow, or was it her truest freedom? Did she love deeply, or did she only chase the idea of love? Did she squander her gifts, or did she create a new kind of gift by living her life as art? These questions have no answers, and perhaps they should not. For to resolve them would be to diminish the mystery, to silence the echo, to fix what was always fluid. Picture, then, the photograph in the drawer lifted at last into the light. The paper is fragile, the image faded, yet the eyes still glimmer, the mouth still curves in mischief, the presence still lingers. Around it, the air is filled with a faint trace of smoke, a whisper of perfume, a memory of laughter that seems to hover just beyond hearing. In that image is the whole of her life. Scandal and sorrow, triumph and ruin, wit and tenderness, all condensed into a gaze that refuses to be forgotten. And so we leave her here, not in silence, but in remembrance, not in pity, but in awe. Tallulah Bankhead, the wildest star of Hollywood and Broadway, the woman who mocked rules and lived as though tomorrow were always uncertain, remains with us still, in words, in laughter, in legend. Her story drifts across time like smoke curling upward, dissolving yet never vanishing, unresolved, eternal.